time Ed blocks, why am I reading so much old-fashioned science fiction? The first obvious answer is because it's in the public domain. However, there are also better reasons to do it than that. I will still be asking the question, is it trashy nonsense? In particular, is it sexist trashy nonsense? The answer is nuanced. However, does it work today? Is it worth listening to? Is it worth reading? Well, the answer is obviously yes, or I wouldn't bother making it. Again, there's slightly more to it than that. Does it work by today's standards? Is it still worth listening to or reading? I think that's quite an interesting topic anyway, but then not everybody wants to be a scholar all the time. Not everybody wants to think about, grand literary theory or anything like that. However, as a curiosity, it has an interest, particularly if you want to look at, historical pictures of women in Western culture. It strikes me that from the stuff I've read, which is on Gutenberg, which is public domain, so it's quite a limited sample, it strikes me that what I've read from this literal pulp fiction, literal in the sense that you read it once and you throw it in the bin. It's either a magazine or one of those really cheap, these things they're not designed to even, they fall apart. You're supposed to throw them away after you've read them. Literal pulp fiction. However, it strikes me that the pulp fiction I've discovered is slightly more interesting than a disposable movie. Sometimes you go to a movie, you go there, you laugh for 2 hours or you have fun, just call it a dumb action movie or whatever. But by the time you've left, you've basically forgotten everything that happened in the movie. I've heard reviews of a number of movies like that. I tend to try to avoid those disposable movies because I'd rather spend my time watching, interesting ones, but whatever. So this pulp fiction has a lot more interesting things to it than disposable movies. I certainly was expecting a lot more sexism than I found. It seems that the sexism usually manifests itself in a simple manner of women simply not being around. When they're doing their space stuff or their sciencey stuff, there's usually a bunch of men doing, not each other, maybe each other. However, I was slightly surprised that the women got a reasonably fair shake most of the time. The female characters have some agency. The male characters tend to be the boss, but the female characters aren't all a bunch of idiots. Dopey, yes, so let me make you a cup of coffee, and that's all they can do. They actually can contribute something to the events of the stories. The men sometimes talk down to them a little bit, but not always. And the women have plenty to do in the story. In fact, much of the time, the men come off a bit worse in their comparisons. There are scenes where men make inappropriate remarks towards women in the manner of calling them a doll or judging them purely on their physical characteristics or assuming that just because they're a woman, they're going to fall into my lap. That happens, and then the woman says, go away, I'm not interested. That happens quite a lot, even from the male writers. Female writers, it happens with the male writers. So often the man looks like a pervy creep, which is good. If you're going to act like that, that is the best possible response. There's one story which I'm reading for my 12 Days of Christmas called Problem Planet, and that is about these two guys who sort of lust after this woman. Close your ears for 10 seconds if you don't want to know what the ending is. The ending is, she says, so they perv over her for much of the story, and then she goes, no, I'm not interested, and leaves. That's the end of the story. Which, so in terms of Problem Planet, despite the fact that is the most problematic story in the 12 Days of Christmas that I've done, it has the best possible outcome. So most of the time, that kind of behavior is either brushed away. Most of the time it's women just not being there. I've recently read quite a famous series of stories by James Blish, very admired old school sci-fi writer, called Cities in Flight. It's quite a long, it's 4 books, so it ends up actually being, I read it all in one, so 700 pages or something. In the whole thing, there's 2 female characters. They're treated fairly, they're smart, they have agency, they're not, flappy Bond girls, but there's only 2 of them. So, of the stories I have done on the channel, I would say the slightly more sexist stories, the vegans were curious. It's probably pronounced vegans, but I think it's funny because then it looks a little bit like vegan, so I pronounced it vegan, but then I changed it around later. That is a story about an alien who comes to Earth, and I think it is a good example of attitudes towards women. So it's a curiosity as a story, but also I think the central joke of the story is quite funny. The central joke of the story being an alien comes to Earth in order to discover how stupid humans could possibly make nuclear weapons, and he discovers sex, which I think is quite funny. It's true that the woman is just sort of there for the alien to have sex with, and she's a bit keen. And she says there's a very odd scene at the end where she doesn't really know what's going on. But it wouldn't be too difficult to rewrite that story and just make her a little bit. So yes, she wants to have sex with the alien, but that's because he survives the death penalty. He survives the electric chair, so she just finds him attractive. That doesn't necessarily have to be sexist. So it wouldn't take too much to alter that story to make it more au fait by today's standards. There is one story I've read which cannot be improved upon, but I think it's an amusing curiosity. And actually, when I made the book, I thought it was hilarious because it was so incredibly sexist. It's not a good story, but I think it's a curiosity, and I think it's funny, and I can laugh at, not with. I can laugh at the writer who thought it was a good idea. Essentially, Love Amongst the Robots is the story. It's on the channel there to be listened to. It's a story about robots rebelling against their masters, and they're trying to find out why, and they're trying to stop them and all that kind of stuff. Eventually, they find out that the reason why the robots are rebelling is because a woman went to the moon base, wherever they are, the space base, and women are really emotional. So, and the robots rebelled because of the increased amount of emotion that women have, which is to say the sexism of the story is fundamental to the plot. Women are over emotional, hyperactive, and that is what made the robots rebel. So that is sexism fundamental to the story. Like I said, that is the exception. I think it's quite an interesting curiosity as it is. So The Love Amongst the Robots is not a good story, but I think it's an interesting curiosity, and I kind of laughing at the stupidity of it. That's usually the exception. So that's quite interesting. Beyond that, are the stories any good? Well, I mean, given that they're not offensively bad, I can probably leave most of that up to you. However, what I would say is that I think this is an aspect of old science fiction. The emphasis is often on the sciencey stuff, so the character stuff is less important. The fact that they're mostly men, all of that kind of stuff, is less important than the sort of the sciencey stuff. The concept of the story is often more important, and much of the time, most of the time, not every time, it works. It's quite well thought out. It doesn't necessarily date very much. The basis is on concepts, ideas, which is sort of what old school sci-fi is all about, and sort of certain levels of hard sci-fi now. The soft sci-fi is the stuff where it's all about characters, like anime characters. It's all about fathers and sons and mothers' relationships with their blah, blah, blah. It's all about people and their interactions, which is how most people seem to like stories. Personally, I mean, I'm all reading short stories now. I think short stories lack character development just because they're short. There's lots of things that short stories lack. Maybe I'll make another video about that another time. You're listening to my short sci-fi stories for interesting concepts and ideas. There are characters and they are introduced well, and most of the time it works. But and it tells together as entertainment. I think it is entertaining. I think the things that happen are fun. There's one, it's not just people sitting around computers talking about science. Stuff happens. It's interesting. And it has quite a lot of thought and idea attached to it. Like I said, there's only that one time when the whole thing falls flat. So for that reason, I will persevere with Sci-Fi Mondays. If you like what I do, I would appreciate your comments. If you have any suggestions for what you want me to do, I would also appreciate your comments. I would like to adapt what I'm doing to my audience. So that also includes any writers out there who want me to make audio with them. If you want the real pro stuff, then you have to pay me, of course. But we can talk about projects on different levels and money and stuff. If you're interested in that as a service, or indeed if you're interested in audio editing as a service, let me know. Or just let me know about, like I said, what you think of the content, other suggestions for different kinds of content. Like I said, I'm focusing on right now on public domain stuff because it's public domain. But I do write stories, but they take a bit longer to make. So I will persevere for the time being with Ed Makes Books and Music Sci-Fi Mondays as is. Some of the stories will be misses, and in a sense that's fine because then they're curiosities. I think it's interesting to find out what old sci-fi is like. It's not all Star Trek and Star Wars. For some of it will be misses, some of it will be hits. I think there's more hits than misses, so I think it's worth carrying on. And it's certainly going to be fun finding out what comes next. I've been Edmund Bloxham. I'll continue to be Edmund Bloxham for all 12 days of the 12 days of Christmas and probably after that. Fare thee well.